In the heart of a sprawling, chaotic city where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and streets buzzed with life, there lived a man named Michael Carter. He was no ordinary citizen. He was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, a position he had earned through years of hard work, dedication, and an unshakable commitment to justice. Michael had spent decades fighting crime, dismantling criminal networks, and ensuring that those who broke the law were held accountable. Yet, despite his accomplishments, he remained humble, a man who believed in fairness and equality above all else. Michael's story began on a chilly winter evening when the city was cloaked in darkness. The streets were quiet except for the occasional hum of passing cars. After a long day at work, Michael climbed into his sleek black sedan and started driving home. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of an ongoing investigation involving corruption within local law enforcement agencies. For weeks, whispers had reached his ears about rogue officers abusing their power, planting evidence, and even extorting money from innocent people. It troubled him deeply, not just because it violated everything he stood for, but because it undermined public trust in the very institutions meant to protect them. As Michael drove through the dimly lit roads, he noticed flashing blue and red lights behind him. Confused, he pulled over to the side of the road. Two police officers approached his car, their faces stern and unreadable. One tapped on the window, signaling for Michael to roll it down. "Good evening, sir," the officer said curtly. "Do you know why we stopped you?" Michael shook his head, perplexed. "No, I don't," he replied calmly. "Is something wrong?" The officer ignored his question and instead asked for his license and registration. Michael handed over the documents without hesitation, confident that nothing was amiss. But as the officer examined them, his expression grew colder. "Sir, we've received reports of a stolen vehicle matching your car's description. We need you to step out of the vehicle." A knot formed in Michael's stomach. Something about the situation felt off. Still, he complied, stepping out of the car with his hands visible. "This is my car," he explained patiently. "You can verify it with the registration or run the plates if needed." But the officers weren't interested in explanations. They exchanged glances before one of them barked, "Keep your hands where we can see them." Their tone shifted from professional to hostile in seconds. Before Michael could react, they grabbed his arms, twisted them behind his back, and slapped handcuffs around his wrists. The metal bit into his skin, but the pain was nothing compared to the shock coursing through him. "Wait a minute," Michael protested, his voice rising. "I'm the director of the FBI. This is a misunderstanding." His words fell on deaf ears. The officers shoved him roughly into the back seat of their patrol car, ignoring his protests. As they sped away, Michael's mind raced. Why were they doing this? Was this some kind of cruel joke? Or was there something more sinister at play? He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. It was personal. Hours later, Michael found himself locked in a cold, sterile holding cell. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the walls. His mind replayed the events of the night, searching for answers. Then it hit him. These officers weren't targeting him because of his actions. They were targeting him because of who he was. A black man in a position of power, someone who dared to challenge the status quo, someone who threatened their unchecked authority. It wasn't just racism, it was fear disguised as hatred. Word of Michael's arrest spread quickly. By morning, headlines screamed across newspapers and television screens. FBI director arrested for alleged crime. Reporters swarmed outside the precinct, microphones thrust forward as cameras rolled. The media circus painted Michael as guilty before he even had a chance to defend himself. Friends and colleagues tried reaching out, but calls went unanswered, messages ignored. It was as though the world had turned its back on him overnight. Behind bars, Michael wrestled with anger and frustration. How could this happen? He had devoted his life to upholding the law, to protecting others from injustice. And now, here he was, a victim of the very system he sought to reform. But amidst the chaos, a spark of determination ignited within him. He knew he couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. If anything, this ordeal only strengthened his resolve to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, the two officers responsible for Michael's arrest celebrated their apparent victory. Back at the precinct, they smirked as they reviewed footage from a hidden camera placed in the interrogation room. They had recorded every word Michael said during his brief questioning, twisting his statements to make it seem like he was confessing to misconduct within the FBI. With this evidence in hand, they devised a plan to blackmail him. They would demand his silence, forcing him to use his influence to shield their department from scrutiny. If he refused, they would leak the video to the press, destroying what little remained of his reputation. Unaware of their scheme, Michael sat in his cell, plotting his next move. He knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. Reaching out to trusted allies within the bureau, he managed to send a cryptic message asking for help. Within hours, a small team of loyal agents sprang into action. They began digging into the backgrounds of the officers involved, uncovering a trail of misconduct that stretched back years. Falsified reports planted evidence, ties to organized crime. It was all there, buried beneath layers of deception. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, Michael realized the magnitude of what he was up against. This wasn't just about him. It was about exposing a culture of corruption that had festered unchecked for far too long. Determined to bring the truth to light, he vowed to fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had suffered under the weight of injustice. And so the stage was set for a showdown unlike any other. In one corner stood Michael Carter, a man driven by integrity and a desire to right wrongs. In the other stood a group of bigoted officers, consumed by greed and arrogance. What happened next would change the course of history, proving once and for all that even in the darkest moments, courage and resilience could shine through. The days following Michael Carter's arrest were a blur of chaos, confusion, and mounting pressure. As the news of his detention spread like wildfire, public opinion quickly turned against him. Headlines screamed accusations, painting him as a criminal rather than the respected leader he had always been. Social media exploded with speculation, memes mocking his predicament, and hashtags calling for his resignation. The man who had once stood as a symbol of justice now found himself at the center of a media storm that seemed determined to tear him apart. Inside the cold, sterile walls of the holding cell, Michael struggled to make sense of it all. He replayed the events of his arrest in his mind over and over again, searching for answers. Why had these officers targeted him? What did they hope to gain by destroying his reputation? And most importantly, how could he prove his innocence when the entire world seemed convinced of his guilt? Despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, Michael refused to give in to despair. Instead, he focused on one thing: survival. He knew that if he wanted to clear his name, he would have to stay calm, think strategically, and fight back. Not with anger, but with evidence. Outside the precinct, whispers of conspiracy began to circulate among those who knew Michael best. His closest allies within the FBI couldn't believe the allegations against him. They knew him too well to accept the narrative being spun by the media. These weren't just colleagues, they were friends who had worked alongside him for years, witnessing firsthand his unwavering dedication to truth and justice. One such ally was Sarah Bennett, a senior agent known for her sharp instincts and relentless determination. When she heard about Michael's arrest, she immediately suspected foul play. Sarah wasted no time springing into action. She gathered a small team of trusted agents, people who shared her belief in Michael's integrity, and began investigating the circumstances surrounding his arrest. Their first step was simple yet crucial: reviewing every detail of the incident. They obtained copies of the police report, scrutinizing it line by line. Something didn't add up. According to the officer's account, Michael had resisted arrest and acted aggressively. But this version of events clashed sharply with everything they knew about him. Michael wasn't reckless or confrontational. He was level-headed, even under immense pressure. There had to be more to the story. As Sarah and her team dug deeper, they uncovered disturbing patterns linked to the two officers involved in Michael's arrest. Both men had long histories of misconduct complaints filed against them, ranging from excessive use of force to racial profiling. Yet, none of these cases had ever resulted in disciplinary action. It was as though they operated above the law, shielded by their badges and an unspoken code of silence within the department. This discovery sent a chill down Sarah's spine. If these officers were willing to abuse their power against ordinary citizens, what lengths might they go to when targeting someone like Michael, a high-profile figure who posed a direct threat to their unchecked authority? Meanwhile, Michael remained trapped in the holding cell, unaware of the efforts underway to save him. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. His captors occasionally taunted him, sneering remarks about how even big shots fall sometimes. But Michael refused to rise to their bait. He kept his head down, biding his time while silently plotting his next move. He knew he couldn't rely solely on external help. He needed to find a way to gather evidence himself, something concrete that could expose the truth. It wasn't until late that night that an opportunity presented itself. A rookie officer assigned to guard the cells approached Michael hesitantly. Unlike the others, this young man seemed uneasy, almost apologetic. "Sir," he whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was listening, "I don't know what's going on here, but I've heard things that don't sit right with me." Michael's heart raced. Could this be the break he needed? He leaned closer, careful not to raise suspicion. "What kind of things?" he asked softly. The rookie hesitated before responding. "There's talk about some kind of setup, something involving you and footage. I'm not sure what it means, but I thought you should know." With those cryptic words, the rookie hurried away, leaving Michael alone once again. But the seed had been planted. Footage. That single word echoed in Michael's mind. What footage? Who had recorded it and why? He realized then that this wasn't just about arresting him. It was about controlling him. Whoever was behind this arrest wanted leverage, something they could use to manipulate him into compliance. Back at FBI headquarters, Sarah and her team were piecing together fragments of information that painted an increasingly sinister picture. Through confidential informants and leaked documents, they learned that the officers involved in Michael's arrest were part of a larger network of corrupt cops operating across multiple precincts. This wasn't an isolated case of rogue behavior. It was systemic corruption rooted deep within the system. The officers weren't merely abusing their power, they were actively working with organized crime syndicates, accepting bribes in exchange for protection and favors. But the most shocking revelation came when Sarah discovered the existence of a secret recording. Apparently, during Michael's brief interrogation, the officers had secretly filmed him, twisting his words to fabricate evidence of misconduct. Worse still, they planned to release the video unless Michael agreed to cooperate with their demands. Essentially, they were blackmailing him, using his own voice against him to silence any potential investigation into their activities. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah knew they had to act fast. Time was running out and the stakes couldn't be higher. She called an emergency meeting with her team, laying out a bold plan. "We need to turn the tables on them," she declared firmly. "If we can catch them red-handed, we'll have undeniable proof of their corruption. But we'll need to move carefully. Any misstep could put Michael in even greater danger." The team brainstormed tirelessly, devising a strategy to trap the corrupt officers without tipping them off. Their plan hinged on deploying undercover agents to pose as criminals offering bribes. If successful, they could record the officers, accepting illegal payments, exposing their true nature and motives. At the same time, Sarah arranged for a press conference to coincide with the sting operation. If executed perfectly, the simultaneous release of damning evidence and public exposure would leave the officers with nowhere to hide. For Michael, however, the waiting game continued. Days stretched into nights, each moment filled with uncertainty. He clung to the hope that his allies were working to free him, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Would they succeed in time? Or would the officers succeed in breaking him first? The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he reminded himself of the countless lives depending on him. Not just his own, but everyone affected, by the corruption plaguing the city. By the end of the second day, tensions reached a boiling point. The officers visited Michael's cell again, this time armed with a chilling ultimatum. "You're either with us or against us," one of them growled, shoving a phone toward him. On the screen was the fabricated video of his supposed confession. "This goes public tomorrow unless you agree to play ball. No more investigations, no more digging into our affairs. Understand?" Michael stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. For a fleeting moment, fear gripped him. But then he remembered something vital. Fear only wins when you let it. With quiet resolve, he looked the officer straight in the eye and said, "Do whatever you want. You won't win." His defiance infuriated the officers, but they left without further confrontation, slamming the cell door behind them. Little did they know, their arrogance would soon lead to their downfall. Unbeknownst to them, Sarah and her team were closing in, ready to strike. And so, as the clock ticked toward the third day, the pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown, one that would determine not only Michael's fate, but also the future of justice in the city. Though the battle ahead promised to be fierce, Michael drew strength from the knowledge that he wasn't fighting alone. Together, he and his allies were prepared to take on the forces of corruption, no matter the cost. The third day of Michael Carter's ordeal began with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The officer's ultimatum loomed over him like a dark cloud, threatening to unleash chaos unless he complied with their demands. But Michael wasn't about to back down. He had spent his entire career standing up to bullies, exposing lies, and fighting for what was right. This moment was no different. It was just another battle in a lifelong war against injustice. Meanwhile, outside the precinct walls, Sarah Bennett and her team were working tirelessly to execute their plan. They knew they were running out of time. If the officers released the fabricated video, it would destroy not only Michael's reputation, but also any chance of holding them accountable. Every second counted, and there was no room for error. Sarah gathered her team in a dimly lit conference room at FBI headquarters, where maps, documents, and surveillance photos covered the walls. The air buzzed with urgency as they finalized every detail of their operation. "Here's how this is going to work," Sarah said firmly, pointing to a map of the city. "We'll deploy 2 undercover agents posing as members of a criminal organization willing to pay off corrupt cops. Their job is simple: offer these officers a bribe big enough to make them bite. Once they accept, we'll have undeniable proof of their corruption." The team nodded, understanding the gravity of the task ahead. One agent, Marcus, raised his hand. "What if they suspect something? What if they realize we're setting them up?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "That's why we need to be smart. These guys are arrogant. They think they're untouchable. We use that against them. Make sure your cover is airtight. Speak their language. Act like one of them. If we play our cards right, they won't see it coming." With the plan set, the team dispersed to prepare. Undercover gear was assembled, fake identities created, and communication devices tested. By nightfall, everything was ready. The sting operation was scheduled to take place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location chosen because it matched the kind of places criminals typically used for illicit deals. It was risky, but it was their best shot at catching the officers in the act. As the hours ticked by, Michael remained locked in his cell, unaware of the storm brewing outside. His mind raced with questions. Would his allies find a way to save him before it was too late? Or would the officers succeed in blackmailing him into submission? Despite the uncertainty, Michael held on to hope. He trusted Sarah and her team implicitly. If anyone could turn the tide, it was them. Back at the warehouse, tension crackled in the air. The 2 undercover agents, Alex and Ryan, waited nervously. In the shadows, their ears tuned to the faint hum of distant traffic. They wore hoodies and carried duffel bags stuffed with bundles of cash, enough to tempt even the most cautious crook. A hidden camera recorded their every move, while surveillance vans stationed nearby monitored the scene through thermal imaging equipment. Everyone involved knew that failure wasn't an option. Finally, headlights pierced the darkness as a car pulled up outside the warehouse. 2 figures stepped out. the officers who had arrested Michael. Their faces were grim, their movements calculated. They scanned the area suspiciously before approaching the entrance. When they entered, Alex greeted them with a smirk. "You're right on time," he said casually, gesturing toward the pile of money on the table. "We've got business to discuss." The officers exchanged glances but didn't hesitate. Greed overrode caution as they walked closer, their eyes glued to the stacks of cash. "What's this about?" one of them asked gruffly, though his tone betrayed his interest. Alex leaned back, feigning nonchalance. "Word on the street is, you guys are looking for extra income. We're here to help. Just a little favor in return for some protection. You scratch our backs, we scratch yours." For a moment, the officers hesitated, but then greed took hold, and they nodded. "Fine," one of them said. "Let's hear it." Ryan slid the duffel bag across the table. "Consider this a down payment. There's plenty more where that came from if you deliver." Without hesitation, the officers grabbed the bag, their hands trembling slightly as they sifted through the bills. The hidden camera captured every second of the exchange, ensuring there would be no denying their guilt later. As they stuffed the money into their jackets, Alex signaled subtly to the surveillance team outside. Within moments, federal agents stormed the warehouse, weapons drawn. "Freeze. Hands where we can see them!" barked an agent as bright lights flooded the room. The officers froze, their faces pale with shock. Realization dawned too late. They had walked straight into a trap. At the same time, Sarah stood in front of a packed press conference hall, her expression steely yet composed. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing as she approached the podium. Behind her, large screens displayed images and videos collected during the investigation. Falsified. Police reports, evidence of bribes accepted by other officers, and now, the footage of tonight's sting operation. The room fell silent as Sarah began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and clear, "tonight marks a turning point in the fight for justice in our city. For years, a network of corrupt officers has operated with impunity, abusing their power, violating the rights of citizens, and betraying the trust placed in them. Tonight, we bring that cycle of corruption to an end." She pressed a button, and the screens behind her lit up with the damning footage of the officers accepting the bribe. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth unfolded before their eyes. Sarah continued, her words cutting through the stunned silence. "These individuals are not above the law. They will face charges for their crimes, and justice will prevail. I want to assure the public that we are committed to rooting out corruption wherever it exists, and to protecting those who seek to do good." As the press conference unfolded, news outlets broadcast the revelations live across the nation. Social media erupted with reactions, hashtags calling for accountability trending within minutes. Public opinion shifted dramatically, with many expressing outrage at the officers' actions and admiration for the FBI's swift response. For Michael Carter, the tide was finally beginning to turn. Inside the holding cell, Michael watched the press conference unfold on a small television mounted high on the wall. His heart swelled with pride and relief as he saw Sarah's determined face on the screen. She had done it. Against all odds, she and her team had exposed the truth and brought the corrupt officers to justice. Tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness but of gratitude. He thought of all the people who had suffered under the weight of unchecked authority, all the lives ruined by the very system meant to protect them, and he vowed never to let such injustice happen again. By morning, the story dominated headlines worldwide. The rogue officers were arrested, their careers reduced to rubble as investigations expanded to uncover further connections within the department. Dozens of others implicated in the scandal faced scrutiny, leading to widespread reforms aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. For Michael, vindication came swiftly. Charges against him were dropped, and he was released from custody to a hero's welcome. Friends, colleagues, and strangers alike hailed him as a symbol of resilience and integrity. Yet, despite the triumph, Michael couldn't shake the scars left by the experience. The betrayal, the humiliation, the fear, it had all taken its toll. But instead of letting bitterness consume him, He chose to focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about creating a better future for everyone. As he returned to work, he made it his mission to ensure that no one else would ever suffer as he had. Corruption might never be fully eradicated, but with vigilance and courage it could be fought, one step at a time. And so, the city moved forward, forever changed by the events that unfolded. Michael Carter's ordeal became a testament to the enduring power of truth and justice. In the face of adversity, he had stood firm, proving that even in the darkest moments, light could still shine through. The days following the sting operation and the press conference marked a turning point, not just for Michael Carter, but for the entire city. The revelations of corruption within the police department sent shockwaves through every level of society. Citizens who had long suspected foul play now had undeniable proof that their worst fears were true. Trust in law enforcement hit an all-time low, with protests erupting outside police headquarters and calls for accountability growing louder each day. For Michael, however, the fight was far from over. While his name had been cleared, he knew that exposing individual officers wasn't enough. The system itself needed to change. As Michael returned to work at FBI headquarters, he was greeted by a mix of emotions. Some colleagues offered him warm smiles and words of support, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The scandal had created divisions even within the bureau, as some questioned whether Michael's ordeal might reflect poorly on the institution as a whole. But Michael didn't let it faze him. He understood that rebuilding trust would take time, not just from the public but also from those who worked alongside him. Still, he remained resolute in his mission, to ensure that justice prevailed, no matter how uncomfortable or challenging the process might be. Sarah Bennett, too, found herself grappling with the aftermath of the investigation. Though proud of what they had accomplished, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Corruption ran deep, and rooting it out entirely would require more than arrests and press conferences. It demanded systemic reform, new policies, stricter oversight, and a cultural shift within law enforcement agencies. Determined to keep the momentum going, Sarah proposed a bold initiative: the creation of an independent task force dedicated solely to investigating misconduct within police departments across the country. Michael immediately embraced the idea. "We can't stop here," he told Sarah during one of their late-night meetings. "This isn't just about punishing the bad apples. It's about preventing future generations from suffering the same injustices we've seen. We need transparency, accountability, and most importantly, action." With Michael's backing, Sarah began assembling the task force. She handpicked agents known for their integrity, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to justice. Each member brought something unique to the table, whether it was expertise in forensic analysis, experience working undercover, or connections within marginalized communities. Together, they formed a formidable team ready to tackle corruption head-on. Meanwhile, the fallout from the scandal continued to unfold. Public outrage showed no signs of abating, with protesters demanding answers and accountability. Many called for the resignation of top officials within the police department, accusing them of turning a blind eye to years of misconduct. Others advocated for sweeping reforms, including body cameras for all officers, civilian review boards with real power, and mandatory psychological evaluations for recruits. The debate raged on, dominating conversations everywhere, from newsrooms to dinner tables. For Michael, watching the public response was both inspiring and humbling. He realized that his ordeal had sparked something much bigger than himself. A movement fueled by anger, frustration, and hope. People were speaking up, refusing to stay silent any longer. It reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place, to give a voice to the voiceless and to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. But the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Not everyone welcomed the changes being proposed. Within the police department, resistance grew fierce. Some officers argued that the reforms went too far, claiming they would hinder their ability to do their jobs effectively. Others dismissed the allegations of widespread corruption as exaggerated, insisting that the actions of a few shouldn't tarnish the reputation of the many. These arguments gained traction among certain segments of the population, creating a divide between those who supported reform and those who opposed it. Despite the pushback, Michael refused to back down. He knew that meaningful change often came with resistance, and he was prepared to face it head-on. In a series of televised interviews, he addressed the nation, appealing directly to the people. "Change is never easy," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "But we cannot allow fear or discomfort to stand in the way of progress. What happened to me was wrong. Not because I'm special, but because it could have happened to anyone. If we want to build a fairer, safer society, we must hold ourselves accountable, even when it hurts." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with millions of viewers. Letters poured into FBI headquarters, many expressing gratitude for his courage and determination. Some shared personal stories of injustice they had faced at the hands of corrupt officers, thanking Michael for shining a light on issues they had long felt powerless to address. Others pledged their support for the reforms, vowing to hold their elected officials accountable until real change was achieved. Encouraged by the public's response, Michael threw himself into the task of implementing the proposed reforms. Working closely with lawmakers, community leaders, and advocacy groups, he helped draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within law enforcement agencies. Key provisions included mandatory de-escalation training for officers, stricter penalties for misconduct, and the establishment of independent oversight committees empowered to investigate complaints without interference from internal affairs. At the same time, Michael made it a priority to engage with communities most affected by police brutality and corruption. He traveled across the country, visiting neighborhoods scarred by violence and mistrust. In town hall meetings and intimate gatherings, he listened to residents' concerns, acknowledging the pain and frustration they felt. "I hear you," he told them repeatedly, "and I promise you, we will do better." These efforts did not go unnoticed. Slowly, but surely, attitudes began to shift. Officers who had initially resisted the reforms started to see the value in them, recognizing that accountability wasn't a threat, but an opportunity to rebuild trust. Community members, too, expressed cautious optimism, hopeful that this time, things might actually improve. Yet amidst the progress, there were still moments of doubt. Late at night, when the world was quiet and the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders, Michael allowed himself to reflect on everything he had endured. The arrest, the humiliation, the fear, it all came rushing back, leaving him exhausted yet determined. He thought of the countless lives touched by corruption, the families torn apart, the dreams shattered, and he reminded himself that giving up was not an option. One evening, as he sat alone in his office poring over documents, Sarah knocked softly on the door. "You should get some rest," she said gently, leaning against the doorway. "You've done more than anyone could ask of you." Michael looked up, offering her a weary smile. "There's still so much left to do," he replied. "But yeah, maybe you're right, just 5 more minutes." Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. "That's what you said 2 hours ago." Reluctantly, Michael closed the folder in front of him and stood up. As they walked out together, he glanced back at his desk where stacks of papers awaited his attention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that step by step they were moving closer to a brighter future. And so the journey continued. The fight against corruption was far from over, but with each victory, no matter how small, hope grew stronger. Michael Carter had become more than just a man. He had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon of light in a world desperate for justice. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. He would never stop fighting, not until fairness and equality became the norm rather than the exception. The weeks that followed the exposure of police corruption became a whirlwind of activity for Michael Carter. The momentum from the scandal had ignited a national conversation about accountability and reform, but it also brought new challenges. Every day seemed to present fresh obstacles: political resistance, public skepticism, and even threats against his life. Yet through it all, Michael remained steadfast, driven by the belief that real change was possible if people worked together. 1. Morning. As Michael arrived at FBI headquarters, he noticed an unusual number of reporters gathered outside the building. Their cameras flashed relentlessly, and microphones were thrust toward him as he stepped out of his car. "Director Carter, what's your response to the backlash against the reforms?" one shouted. Another chimed in. "Are you concerned about the safety of law enforcement officers under these new policies?" The barrage of questions was relentless, but Michael maintained his composure. He offered brief, measured responses before heading inside, where Sarah Bennett waited with updates on their ongoing efforts. "Things are heating up," Sarah said as they walked to Michael's office. "The unions are pushing back hard, claiming the reforms will put officers' lives at risk. Some politicians are using that narrative to stall the legislation." Michael sighed, sinking into his chair. "It's exactly what we expected. Change always scares people, especially when it threatens their power. But we can't let fear dictate our decisions. If anything, this pushback proves how necessary these reforms are." Sarah nodded, handing him a folder filled with recent developments. Among them was a disturbing report. Several anonymous threats had been made against Michael and other key figures involved in the reform movement. One message, scrawled in crude handwriting and mailed to FBI headquarters, read, "Stop meddling, or face the consequences." Though unsettling, Michael brushed it off. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said firmly. "But I won't be silenced. Not now, not ever." Despite the risks, Michael continued to champion the cause. He traveled extensively, meeting with community leaders, activists, and law enforcement officials willing to embrace reform. In Detroit, he addressed a crowd of hundreds at a rally organized by civil rights groups. Standing on a makeshift stage, he spoke passionately about the need for transparency and trust. "We cannot build a safer society without accountability," he declared, his voice echoing through the square. "Every officer must understand that their badge is not a shield, it's a responsibility. And every citizen deserves to feel safe, respected, and protected." His words earned thunderous applause, but not everyone shared the sentiment. At a town hall meeting in Chicago, tensions boiled over during a heated exchange between residents and local police representatives. When Michael attempted to mediate, some officers accused him of siding with criminals and undermining their authority. The confrontation left him disheartened but more determined than ever to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. Back in Washington, D.C., the legislative battle raged on. Lawmakers debated the proposed reforms late into the night, with passionate arguments erupting on both sides of the aisle. Supporters praised the measures as long overdue steps toward justice, while opponents warned of unintended consequences. Amid the chaos, Michael worked tirelessly behind the scenes, lobbying senators and representatives to support the bill. His reputation as a survivor of corruption gave him credibility, and many lawmakers found it difficult to dismiss his pleas. Meanwhile, the independent task force led by Sarah made significant strides in uncovering additional cases of misconduct across the country. Using advanced data analytics and whistleblower testimonies, they identified patterns of abuse that had gone unnoticed for years. In Los Angeles, they exposed a ring of officers who had falsified evidence to secure convictions. In Miami, they uncovered ties between rogue cops and drug cartels. Each revelation added fuel to the growing demand for reform, reinforcing the idea that corruption wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Yet, progress came at a cost. As the investigations expanded, so did the risks. One evening, Sarah received a chilling phone call from an agent embedded in a particularly dangerous operation. "They know we're onto them," the agent whispered urgently. "Be careful, Sarah. These guys aren't playing around." Sarah immediately informed Michael, who insisted on increasing security protocols for everyone involved. "I won't lose anyone else to this fight," he said grimly. Despite the danger, neither of them considered backing down. They knew the stakes were too high. Amid the turmoil, Michael found solace in unexpected places. Letters of encouragement poured in daily, many from ordinary citizens inspired by his resilience. A young girl named Maya sent a drawing of a superhero labeled Director Carter, accompanied by a note that read, "Thank you for standing up for us, you're my hero." Michael kept the picture on his desk, a reminder of why he continued to push forward despite the odds. As spring approached, signs of hope began to emerge. Public opinion polls showed growing support for the reforms, with a majority of Americans favoring increased accountability for law enforcement. Several states passed their own versions of the federal legislation, implementing measures like mandatory body cameras and civilian oversight boards. Even within the police department, attitudes started to shift. Officers who had initially resisted the changes began to see the benefits, reporting improved relations with the communities they served. But the journey was far from smooth. Resistance persisted, particularly in regions where corruption ran deepest. In New Orleans, a group of retired officers launched a campaign to discredit the reforms, claiming they would lead to anarchy. Their rhetoric gained traction among certain factions, sparking protests that turned violent. Michael watched the news coverage with a heavy heart, knowing that fear and misinformation could undo months of hard work. Determined to counteract the negativity, Michael embarked on a media tour, appearing on talk shows and podcasts to explain the importance of the reforms. On one program, a host challenged him, asking, "Isn't it unfair to paint all officers as corrupt? Aren't you alienating the good ones?" Michael leaned forward, his expression calm but resolute. "Let me be clear, I have immense respect for the men and women who dedicate their lives to protecting others. This isn't about painting anyone with a broad brush. It's about ensuring that those who abuse their power are held accountable, no matter who they are. Because when bad actors go unpunished, it tarnishes the entire profession." His answer resonated with viewers, earning praise from both supporters and skeptics alike. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. By summer, the federal legislation finally reached Congress for a vote. The atmosphere was electric as lawmakers convened for the historic session. Protesters gathered outside the Capitol, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." Inside, debates stretched late into the night, with emotions running high. When the final tally was announced, the room erupted. In cheers, the bill had passed. For Michael, the victory was bittersweet. While it marked a monumental step forward, he knew the real work lay ahead: enforcing the laws, monitoring compliance, and addressing any loopholes that might arise. Still, he allowed himself a rare moment of celebration. That evening, surrounded by his team, he raised a glass in quiet gratitude. "To justice," he said simply, "and to all of you for making this possible." As the nation celebrated the landmark achievement, Michael reflected on how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. The fight against corruption was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Real, tangible progress was possible, and as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, the future remained bright. The passage of the federal reform legislation marked a turning point, but Michael Carter knew it was only the beginning. True change wouldn't happen overnight. It required constant vigilance, unwavering commitment, and a willingness to adapt. For Michael, this meant shifting his focus from exposing corruption to ensuring that the reforms were implemented effectively. He understood that laws on paper meant little unless they translated into action, into real, measurable improvements in people's lives. In the months following the bill's approval, Michael threw himself into overseeing its rollout. Task forces were established in cities across the country, tasked with monitoring compliance and addressing violations swiftly. Community leaders were invited to participate in these efforts, creating partnerships between law enforcement and the public they served. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, their footage subject to independent review. Civilian oversight boards gained unprecedented authority, empowered to investigate complaints without interference from internal affairs departments. Slowly but surely, the culture within police departments began to shift. Yet, resistance lingered. In some areas, entrenched attitudes proved difficult to overcome. Officers accused of misconduct sometimes found ways to exploit loopholes or delay accountability. Others resigned rather than comply with the new regulations, claiming the reforms made their jobs impossible. While frustrating, Michael saw these challenges as opportunities to refine the system further. "Every problem we encounter is a chance to improve," he told Sarah during one of their strategy meetings. "We can't expect perfection right away, but we can keep pushing forward." To address lingering skepticism, Michael launched an initiative called Bridging the Divide. The program brought together officers and community members for open dialogues, fostering mutual understanding and trust. In Atlanta, a group of teenagers sat down with local police officers to share their fears and frustrations. At first, the conversation was tense, filled with accusations and defensiveness. But as the evening wore on, barriers began to break down. One officer admitted feeling trapped by outdated training methods, while a young woman spoke candidly about losing her brother to police brutality. By the end of the session, both sides had agreed to work toward solutions, not just for themselves, but for future generations. These grassroots efforts yielded unexpected results. In Chicago, a neighborhood notorious for tension between residents and law enforcement saw a dramatic drop in violent crime after implementing collaborative patrols. Officers worked side by side with community volunteers, combining resources and expertise to tackle issues like gang violence and drug trafficking. Similar successes emerged in other cities, proving that cooperation could lead to tangible benefits. Despite the progress, threats against Michael and his allies persisted. Anonymous messages continued to arrive, warning him to abandon his crusade. One night, as he returned home from a long day at the bureau, he noticed a suspicious car parked outside his house. Its headlights were off, and no one appeared to be inside. Instinctively, Michael alerted security, who discovered the vehicle belonged to a known associate of disgraced officers implicated in earlier scandals. Though unsettling, the incident reinforced Michael's resolve. "They're scared," he told Sarah later. "And they should be, because we're not stopping." As time went on, Michael's role evolved. No longer just the face of the reform movement, he became a mentor to younger agents eager to carry the torch. He spent countless hours guiding them through complex investigations, teaching them the importance of integrity and empathy. "Being an agent isn't just about catching bad guys," he often said. "It's about protecting the innocent and upholding the values we claim to stand for." His leadership inspired others to step up. Sarah Bennett, once hesitant to take center stage, emerged as a powerful advocate for systemic change. She spearheaded educational campaigns aimed at raising awareness about corruption and empowering citizens to report wrongdoing. Her tireless efforts earned her national recognition, cementing her status as a key figure in the ongoing fight for justice. By the end of the year, the impact of the reforms was undeniable. Crime rates dropped in many urban areas, thanks in part to improved community relations. Public trust in law enforcement climbed steadily, though it remained far from where it needed to be. Still, the progress gave Michael hope. He envisioned a future where children grew up without fearing those sworn to protect them, a world where fairness and equality weren't aspirations but realities. One evening, as snow blanketed the city, Michael stood on the balcony of his apartment, gazing out at the skyline. The lights twinkled like stars, each one representing a life touched by the events of the past year. He thought of the hardships he had endured, the wrongful arrest, the blackmail, the relentless battles, and how they had shaped him into the man he was today. Painful as those experiences were, they had also strengthened his resolve to make a difference. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. "I figured you could use some company," she said with a smile, handing him one of the mugs. They stood together in silence, watching the snow fall gently over the city. "You know," Michael said after a while, "there was a time when I wondered if all of this was worth it. If fighting such a massive system could ever really make a difference." Sarah nodded. "And now?" Michael took a sip of his drink, his expression thoughtful. "Now I know it is. Not because we fixed everything, we haven't. but because we've started something bigger than ourselves, something that will keep growing, even after we're gone. Sarah smiled, her eyes reflecting the glow of the city below. That's what makes you special, Michael. You never give up, even when the odds seem impossible. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the journey they had undertaken hung in the air, mingling with the promise of brighter days ahead. Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude for Sarah, for his team, for the countless individuals who had supported him along the way. Most of all, he felt grateful for the opportunity to serve, to stand up for what was right, and to leave the world better than he had found it. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the start of a new year, Michael turned to Sarah. "Here's to the next chapter," he said softly. "Whatever comes our way, we'll face it together." Together they raised their mugs in a quiet toast, the city shimmering before them like a beacon of hope. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, fraught with obstacles yet unseen. But Michael knew one thing for certain. As long as there were people willing to fight for justice, the light would always find a way to shine through the darkness. And so the story of Michael Carter came full circle, not as an ending, but as a beginning. His ordeal had transformed him, shaping him into a symbol of resilience and courage. Through every trial and triumph, he had proven that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the human spirit could endure. Justice might not always come swiftly or easily, but with determination, compassion, and unity, it was always within reach.